Hey folks, today we're going to talk about squatting. We're going to talk about how to get started squatting if you've never squatted before. Now, squatting is one of the 6 fundamental movements of calisthenics that form the foundation of all calisthenics exercises. And I would argue it's one of the 2 most fundamental movements of human life, of anything you do in the world. The other one being pushing yourself up with your hands from a seated or from a resting position. Pushing yourself up and standing up. When you get to be 80, 90, or 100 years old, one of the strongest measures of your quality of life and your longevity is going to be your ability to transfer, to come from a seated position, push themselves up into a standing position, turn, and then sit back down again. For younger folks, standing up is something that you do all the time. Standing up under load, whether you're picking something up on your back or pulling something up off the ground, is again a fundamental movement. If you want to be able to jump, that squat movement is exactly the same thing. You're just adding a little toe push at the end. Absolutely fundamental to everything we do. If you're going to run, you need to work that flexion at the knee as well that we don't really work in the squat movement. But for everything else that we do in life, 9 times out of 10, it's based upon the squat movement. So let's break it down a little bit. When we squat, we're essentially doing 2 things. Well, three things, 3 joints moving. Ankles going from dorsiflexion to neutral position. Knees going from flexion to extension. Hip going from flexion to extension. So the muscles that are firing are going to be primarily the glutes, extending that hip, the quads, extending that knee, and the calves really don't fire a whole lot as they would in a jump squat when you're pushing off like this, but they do fire a little bit to put your heels into a neutral position from that dorsiflex position. When we talk about starting squatting from 0 to like you've never squatted before, some people have different ways of doing it. They'll get you on a squat rack, or they'll have you holding onto a post like this so you can lower yourself properly. I like to start with something that everybody does every single day of their lives, and that is get into and get out of a chair. If you can perfect the technique of getting into and out of a chair, you will have an opportunity to practice squatting a dozen times a day, and you won't have to change anything. So here's what that looks like. You can use anything for this. You can use a chair. I don't have chairs in my garage except the ones that are folded on the shelf and they're a pain to get out. But I have a 5-gallon bucket. And this 5-gallon bucket is a great height for this because it's a couple inches lower than my knee. And when I squat to parallel, which is for weightlifting, when we say squat to parallel, that means that my hip joint is lower than my knee joint, or lower than equal to my knee joint. If I have a bucket that's just below my knee joint, when I touch it with my butt, I'm going to be at parallel or below. And then for more advanced movements, I can use a lower block or no block at all. But really all you want to start out with is a chair, just a regular sitting height chair, and then you can gradually lower it from there. So here's what it looks like. We're going to start sitting down. We're going to think about our posture in a seated position. So feet just about shoulder width apart. My knees and my toes are pointing in the same direction, wherever this is comfortable for me. So what was it that everybody was complaining about a couple of years ago on the internet, the man spreading or whatever it was, taking up more space than you need? Well, there's a reason for that. It's actually a functional movement pattern. That's probably not why people are doing it, but it is actually a functional movement pattern. We can start with, you can sit with your knees closer together. My toes are still pointing in the same direction. You can start with my knees really super far apart. My toes are still pointing in the same direction. The most important thing is wherever your knees are and your feet are, they're pointing in the same direction when you're in a seated position. the other thing I want to be cognizant of is where my heels are in relation to my knees. In order to get balance, I can't have my heels forward of my knees, because now I have to throw myself onto my heels in order to get balanced in that bottom of the squat. I don't want them way back here, because that lowers my knees. And now I'm at, well, this is a short block, but if it were a regular high chair, I wouldn't be at parallel. And from here, this angle here is a lot more acute, and most people who haven't trained can't fire effectively from this acute angle. What I want is my shins to be more or less upright. People with strict powerlifting backgrounds or strict powerlifting techniques will often insist upon vertical shins. That's easy to do when you're only coming to parallel, stopping and going back up. But as soon as you talk about dropping below parallel and dropping into a full squat, which is eventually what we want to get to, is a full range of motion squat, you're not going to be able to maintain vertical shins. It's just not biomechanically possible, or at least not without a level of flexibility that I don't possess. So what I want is my shins just a little bit past vertical. So my heel is just a little bit closer to my butt than my knee. Maybe about a hand's breadth. You kind of have to play around with that one. So the next joint that we're going to look at is the hip joint. What I want is I want my back straight and all the flexion to be happening at my hip. And this is where I want you to put in some practice here. Actually, this really hurts to sit on. It's got that plastic ring that's got the little jabby-uppy things in it. Not comfortable at all. Yeah, not comfortable at all. So, this is what I mean by flexing at the hip as opposed to flexing in your spine. So watch carefully. I'm putting my hands on the spine of my hip right here, on the top of the crest of my pelvic bones, and I'm going to move my hips back and flexing, extending, flexing, and extending at the hip joint. That's what we want. That's the movement that we want for a squat, is a hip hinge. When I do that, my spine is remaining neutral. Let's see, this is probably a better angle to see the neutral spine, just based on where the camera is. Neutral spine, flexed spine, extended spine. We don't want an extended spine. That's putting way too much tension on these erector spinae muscles, on the muscles that pull my back into extension like this. And if we start squatting under load, that's going to take a lot of tension that they don't need. This puts my back in a very unsafe position, where if I dynamically move, or see, when I went to dynamically move, I braced automatically and went back toward a neutral spine. But if I were trying to dynamically move like this, what I'm doing is compressing my spine like that. That puts a lot of shearing forces on those vertebrae and can cause them to shift. And I've had lots and lots of pain from things like that. So this is where sitting on a chair or a block or something, at the bottom of the squat, we can play with maintaining that neutral spine and getting all of the movement in the waist, in the middle of our body, getting all of that movement from a hip hinge instead of a spine flexion or extension. How do we do that? We brace. And this is why I think starting here in a seated position at the bottom of the squat makes sense, is because we can practice bracing at the bottom of the squat. Here's what bracing means. Your spine is a column of blocks sitting on top of each other. They have static stabilizers, which are ligaments that run between those blocks to hold them together. And they have dynamic stabilizers, which are muscles that attach to the blocks at various levels and then attach to other bones in your pelvis mainly. And those muscles can pull that spine into different shapes and positions. In order to maintain a neutral spine, especially under a weighted squat, a lot of people will primarily pull with their back muscles. And they just kind of pull until their spine is in generally where they want it. And then they just try and hold tension in their back muscles there to keep their spine aligned. That's dangerous, and you're using only 2 or a handful of very, very tiny muscles to support an awful lot of weight, depending on how good you get at squatting. Or if you're jumping, that puts a lot of torque on that spine. Bracing means we're bringing in the obliques, the rectus abdominis, the internal and external obliques, these abdominal wall muscles all the way around. We're bringing them into the equation. So instead of pulling my spine up from the back, I'm now creating a wall around the front that's going to support it in position exactly where I want it. And it's super, super easy to do, but it takes a little bit of practice. So I start by relaxing my abs, and I want big fat tummy. My grandpa Policano, he used to say, I asked him, "Grandpa, why is your tummy so big?" He's like, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And eventually I'm gonna need a wheelbarrow to put my tummy in. And he said, I just get myself a wheelbarrow, I set it in front of me, put my tummy in the wheelbarrow, and away I go. And that's what I want you to think of. You're sitting here squatting with your knees, your feet, knees exactly where they're supposed to be. And we're gonna puff out our tummy and put that tummy in a wheelbarrow. Now, with the tummy puffed out, I'm going to close my glottis. And that means it's like, if I were holding my breath, no air is coming in or out. I'm gonna close that. Or alternately, I can pinch my lips and breathe out just through my lips and make that hissing noise. Any one of those noises is acceptable. You can do that. Whatever noise you want to make, what you're doing is you're forcing air against closed vocal cords and semi-closed vocal cords and a semi-closed glottis. And what that does is it creates back pressure. All very important that when you do this, you clench your butt. Trust me on this one. The pelvic floor muscles are the muscles that hold in the pee and the poop. If you don't clench them and you build up a whole lot of intra-abdominal pressure, things can happen, embarrassing things. So, I'm gonna clench my butt. And now my spine is braced, just like that. It was that easy. I've been doing it a while. I can talk and maintain a braced spine at the same time. Most people can't do that. The other thing that I'm doing that you shouldn't do if you're a beginner is turning and looking while maintaining that braced spine. Don't want to do that. You want to maintain your in a neutral position. So if I drop my hands down like this, they're both symmetrically on my knees. Puff out that tummy, clench the butt, close the glottis, and suck in my gut. And just suck it all in like that. Now, once I've practiced doing that for a while, now I'm going to practice holding it and then hinging at the hip. Now, we're going to practice moving into a balanced bottom position. And what that looks like is, I want to be here instead of here. Because if I try to extend my legs here, nothing's going to happen because I have no leverage. But even if it did, let's say that I had a wall at my back, I could push and I would be pushing straight back in this direction, which is not where I want to go. I want to go this direction. A squat actually kind of moves you a little bit forward or vertical when you do it correctly. So I've got to practice getting to here, this position where my body weight is centered over my heels. Here's what that looks like. Feet and knees shoulder width apart, toes pointing in the same direction as my knees. My heels just behind my knees. I'm going to clench my butt. Well, first I'm going to puff out my abs, clench my butt, close the glottis, and lean forward. And that's all there is to it. You see the difference in my balance? All of my weight is behind my heels. All of my weight is balanced on my heels. And from here, it's a simple matter of just straightening my legs. And that's a squat. And this is why I usually, especially old people, patients that come in, I usually have them practice just getting into and out of a chair, like this. That's for a 70-year-old lady with osteoporosis. That's all she really needs to be able to do, is just practice getting into and out of a chair. But for younger people, it's a good start. If you've never squatted, that's a good place to begin. One little pro tip here. So I'm going to turn around like this. Your glutes, actually, there are 3 glute muscles. There's glute maximus, which is the big, bulky one that everybody knows and loves. There's the glute medius and the glute minimus. And it goes from back to front, maximus, medius, minimus. If you take your hands and put them in your hip pockets, you're basically cupping that glute minimus. Everybody tries to work the maximus because it's the biggest, but honestly, in terms of overall hip and spine health, I would say the glute medius and minimus are just as important, if not more important. And the reason for that has to do with pelvic tilt. So this is a neutral pelvis, this is anterior pelvic tilt, and this is posterior pelvic tilt. People who are very flexible will sometimes walk around in posterior pelvic tilt, which means that these muscles on the front here are loose enough that their pelvis can actually tilt backwards at baseline. That's not very common, especially in America. Don't worry about why. More commonly, I see people walking around in anterior pelvic tilt, meaning the hamstrings that pull like this and the glutes that rotate like this are weak. They're not firing on all cylinders. What that does over time is it creates this unstable platform for their spine. So then, in order to stand upright, they go like this. And they pull their spine into hyperflexion or hyperlordosis. And it puts tension on these erector spinae muscles back here and all the other muscles that pull the spine into extension like that, and sets people up for back spasms. The way to fix that is to activate, 1, strengthen the hamstrings. Squatting appropriately will do that. And 2, strengthen these glute medius and minimus. What these muscles do is they pull like this, and they pull that spine into a neutral position. Or they pull the hips into a neutral position, not anteriorly tilted and not posteriorly tilted. Although if you continue to fire them, you will extend the hip past neutral. It's important to maintain the tension on those muscles, to maintain them firing at the bottom of the squat, because that's where people get hurt. And here's what it looks like when they get hurt. We come down like this, and my pelvis rotates. Either it collapses forward like this, and I have to chase it, or it collapses backwards. I tuck my tail under, and then I'm sitting down with a flexed spine. The muscles that are going to maintain that are these muscles right here. And when you get good at squatting, eventually, and you pay attention to what your body's doing, eventually you'll be able to feel the tension in these muscles. You'll be able to feel them firing like that. I can feel them firing. But I've been practicing it for years. If you haven't been, an easy way to get them fired up is to use a towel will work, or one of these handy dandy little elastic bands. And all you do is you put it around your knees like this, and you go, and that's your glute minimus. That's firing right there. And piriformis and a bunch of other little muscles, tiny muscles in the hip joint capsule that are important for overall health, but really hard to work because they're about that big. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna push it out and hold it. And from here, move into my centered weight position, and then drive up. But when I drive up, I'm trying to maintain outward tension on this elastic band. And if I don't want to hold it with my hands, I just double it over, step through it. Oops. And that is the baby beginner squat.